Hiya! Right, I know this seems a bit weird using a monitor and a guitar and some bloke talking to you, but this is kind of how I think it works well. So, oh, there's the guitar, by the way, if you want to have a quick look. Welcome to the future, then, hey? Who'd have thought we'd be living in the future? Certainly who'd have thought it'd turn out like this? I think Dead Slash has got the right idea, hasn't he, really, for this particular year? So, how did all those predictions work out from my childhood or your parents' time? Not all that well, did they? So, I remember reading a book by Magnus Pike. He was a guy who had loads of arm movements. His arms were all over the show, and he wrote a book in 1980 trying to predict life in 2030, which is only 10 years off, right? So he kind of says, a personal view of the world of 2030, a world in which everything or very little may be different. He's kind of hedging his bets there, really. And I look, 95p for a book. What a price. So he says, you may be living in a house made of plastic. Well, we've already got that, haven't we? It's called a caravan, and they're all right, but I wouldn't aspire to live in one. You might have a train that goes the speed of sound. That definitely didn't work out. I'm happy if mine isn't going the speed of stopped. But this one is a bit better. It's got a TV screen, a wall-sized TV screen you can order groceries on thanks to the silicon chip in your home computer. So he's actually getting something right here. So at the end, my job as a senior patent examiner is I'm supposed to kind of be able to see technological trends a bit. So at the end, I'll tell you some of my Magnus Pike-like predictions. So we've been doing this for ages, trying to look forward into the future with varying success. And we've been doing this throughout history. So Plato's Republic looked forward, Roger Bacon, Thomas More, Utopia. Utopia means nowhere because it was a very positive view of the future. Francis Bacon and L.S. Mercier. But then this guy comes along, Thomas Malthus, and he paints an awful view of the future where resources are outstripped by population. And thereafter, the predictions get really quite dystopic. They get really depressing and pessimistic. So this was one of the first sci-fi movies, Metropolis. It's a bit grim. And then out of these two, which of these two is going to win in 2020? I think it's a pretty close race, don't you think? So we've been doing this since classical times, right? This is supposed to be the very best predictor ever, Nostradamus. And this is supposed to be his very best prediction. If you read through it, it just reads like a very vague poem, doesn't it? People think this is really accurate because this word for the Danube, Hister, people say, oh, well, that looks like Hitler. And it's mentioning Germany. So he must be predicting World War II. Load of rubbish. It's just a very vague poem. And then finally, of course, we have the biggest wild goose chase in the history of science, which is astrology. There is only one horoscope I've ever seen that is accurate. It's scarily accurate. And it is this one. The stars and planets will not affect your life in any way, regardless of when you were born. So, we have trouble making predictions into next week. And yet, we can predict things like total eclipses to the second a century off, right? How can we do that, but we can't even predict something for next week? This is kind of interesting. So, the reason we can predict total eclipses is because Newton's laws work on a very, very stable system. This is my favorite animation of the solar system, right? You're used to thinking of it as a kind of atom system with a nucleus and things going around it. But of course, the sun is moving around the galaxy itself. So you are getting this kind of corkscrew in because the whole system is moving. And you can make very, very careful, accurate predictions for these kinds of systems because they're really, really stable. So what people thought was, right, if we can work out the motion of the planets, then because the planets cause all of our daily lives, that's what they thought, a load of rubbish, of course, then we should be able to predict our daily lives if we can predict things as well as total eclipses. There's 3 reasons why you just can't do that. There's 3 reasons why predicting things on an everyday scale is nothing remotely like predicting things in terms of a century off for a very, very stable planetary system. First one is chaos. So here I have my chaos pendulum, right? So you can see this little green light, yeah? Now, if it was a very, very stable system, like a planetary system, then I could just let it go, and I actually could predict the motion of the pendulum to a great accuracy, right? What if I put a little hinge in the middle of the pendulum? You might go, well, that's a slightly more complex system. You might be able to predict it, but a bit less accurately. If I show you what happens when I release the pendulum this time, without braining myself, there is no way I'm going to be able to predict the path of that green light from a simple system to a complex, chaotic system with just a single addition of a little hinge thing, right? And that applies to all kinds of other systems in our daily life as well. The weather is a perfect example, where tiny little effects can have huge consequences next week or the week after. Another reason is quantum physics. So you've heard of the uncertainty principle, perhaps, the consequences which are things like a Young's double slit experiment. Again, the uncertainty principle means that there are measurements that you can make which are fundamentally limited in how accurate they can be. You can either know, for a little particle, you can either know exactly where it is or how fast it's moving, but the universe doesn't allow you to know both of those at the same time with infinite accuracy. And then finally, relativity came along and is actually provable via total eclipses because the stars behind the sun seem to move because space-time itself is being warped. It's a bit weird. And that has knocked out Newton's absolute space and time and perfect prediction. What about time's direction, right? So if you think of your breakfast gives you the direction of time. The eggs scramble. They don't magically become eggs again. You stir the milk into the coffee. You never see the coffee and the milk just randomly separate. And if you're one of those people who's a bit windy in the morning, it would be really weird if one of them went back in again. All of this tells you the direction of time, right? There is a specific direction. And that's not really anything to do with chaos or quantum or relativity. That is just to do with plain old statistics, right? So here I've got a bunch of particles in a box, okay? And they're all bouncing around. And the thing about this is if I, so if I reversed the order of that film, it would look exactly the same. You wouldn't think any kind of physical law was being violated. But what if I put a little hole in the box, all right? So they bounce around and then occasionally some come out into the wider space. Right, if I were to run that one backwards, that would start to look weird, wouldn't it? It's not impossible for anything to bounce around and just about find its way into the hole, but if loads of them did, you'd just go, well, that really is odd. You wouldn't say it's impossible. What you would say is vastly, vastly improbable. What we're talking about here is statistical mechanics, invented by Ludwig Boltzmann, the father of statistical mechanics. His work, sadly, he hanged himself. His work was continued by Paul Ehrenfest. Sadly, he shot himself. So now it's our turn to learn about statistical mechanics. The second law of thermodynamics tells you the direction of time. Disorder always has to increase, and there will always be a source of disorder in the real world that is pretty much absent in space. Disorder around us is just everywhere. That's why we can't make our predictions. So I did kind of tell you I'd make some actual Magnus Pikey predictions. Just flick through some of these. Okay, right. So this guy is Buckminster Fuller, name of an architect. Now, he had some pretty good ideas, right? Generally to do with these very strong domes that he invented. He thought, right, you could plonk them down in a field and they'd be very sturdy and secure. They could be new houses, right? Because of the strength in their shape. What he didn't kind of count on was how difficult it is to make a nice house. If you've ever seen a building site, it looks like the Somme, doesn't it? You don't just plonk a house there. All the electricity and the sewage and the water and the mains and telecoms and gas and all the rest of it, all that has to be put in to make a decent brick house. So that wasn't really going to catch on. Question is, might something like that catch on now that we've got such different materials? There's some really, really promising materials. So about 20 years ago, they found a new allotrope of carbon, which was in a ball shape. So they named it after the architect who made structures out of balls and domes like this. They called it Buckminster Fullerene. Soon after that, you got little tubes of carbon called nanotubes. They've already found some really interesting uses because they're so strong. Not long after that was aerogel. This is an incredibly light substance. If you've ever held aerogel, you can barely feel that there's anything on your hand at all. This is a picture of a piece of aerogel floating on a Bunsen flame and protecting the flour sat on top of it. Because air, as well as being incredibly light, aerogel is an incredibly miraculously good insulator, right? But the most miraculous material of all has to be graphene. This was the Nobel Prize 10 years ago. What it is basically pure two-dimensional carbon, right? It is it is miraculously strong and miraculously light. If you had a sheet of this stuff, 1 atom thick, you could make a cat hammock out of it. That's how strong it is. If it's as thick as cellophane, as cling film, an elephant could stand on a pencil on it and it wouldn't go through. And it would actually feel lighter than cling film. It's an absolutely remarkable material that is starting to find genuine real-world uses all over the place. So if I were to put my Magnus Pike hat on and just look into the future, maybe a decade or possibly 2, perhaps, right? One of the other things about graphene, there is only one substance that goes through graphene, and that is water. You can just get a sheet of graphene, stick seawater through it, and you end up with pure water. It is the easiest means of filtering seawater you can possibly find. This is Bill Gates drinking water that was raw sewage just a few minutes ago. I always think he's fed up us enough crap, really, hasn't he? So it's kind of fair dues. Another really useful thing for graphene is aeroponics. You can grow your own food in a very small space if you've got the energy for it. Instead of soil is a pretty inefficient means of growing stuff because so many organisms are competing for the nutrients of the soil. If you can just have pressurized steam with the nutrients in it, you can grow food incredibly quickly. So this is a kind of warehouse full of plants that is basically the equivalent of several acres of farmland, right? My favorite building in the world is the Arctic Cathedral in Tromsø. I've been to it. It is absolutely beautiful, and I'd love to live there and just watch the northern lights through the windows. That would be my perfect home, right? Now, it's unlikely I'll ever be able to buy it and live there, but here's another cool thing about graphene. You can make it into a bendy screen really quite cheaply if you've got the manufacturing in on it. So what do you do with bendy graphene screens and a building? If you think about it, like Magnus Pike was saying, you could have a wall-sized screen, both indoor and outdoor, showing whatever you liked. I could live in a graphene house and pretend that I was living in the Arctic Cathedral, just if I just had a structure like that, covered in graphene screens. Best thing about it, it would also be light enough to have wheels, so that's a pretty cool caravan. It would be bulletproof, and if you think of the screens showing the view from a camera behind it, it would be invisible. I'd basically have a bulletproof, invisible house like Predator. So there's some of my little predictions. I think I'll just leave you with that. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. So I'm a bioscientist myself. So you know, to get to hear about physics again takes me back some way, but it's fantastic all the same. So we probably have time for a quick couple of questions, just because we're coming up to the line, so to speak. But I guess if I start off, so say, what do you think the most accurate prediction has been so far, say in the year 2020, to what, say 10 years ago or 20 years ago, what was predicted for this year? What would you say the most accurate prediction has been?
I would say exactly what we're doing now. When I was at university, the idea that you could easily have a face-to-face call, I mean, my phone at university, it was the size of a brick and basically as useful, you know. You could only phone someone else who had a brick like yours. You couldn't even phone a landline. at the time. It was weird. If you'd have told me at university that I could watch movies and read books and watch live sport and have video conversations on my phone and it could beat me at chess, I would have thought you were absolutely mental. And yet, here we are. We live on our phones now. And that, I mean, if you think of the Star Trek that is what mobile phones became. The little communicator from Star Trek became an actual little oyster shell mobile phone, didn't it? And now look at us. We are literally living our lives via our phones. If COVID had to come along then, rather than now, we would be absolutely stuffed. We would have had riots already because no one could do anything. And yet here we are. And difficult as it is, we're kind of okay in a way, you know?
No, absolutely. You know, the ability to share information and I guess, as you say, the rapid development in phones that allow us to do things like that have really come away and actually keeping these things at bay. And yeah, particularly with COVID, I can only imagine how ironically dystopian the future might have been if it's something that hit back then. But
this program we're using right now, Zoom, had a projection of hopefully getting to where they are today in 2025. That was when they launched Zoom. They thought, hopefully we'll have a number of global users by 2025 that is anywhere near what the number of people using Zoom is right now. That is how quickly it has changed, literally since February.